Noah, thank you very much for joining me on FORTE podcast. How are you today, sir?
I'm really well, Anthony, and it's most unusual. We met each other just a few hours ago, and I already feel as though we know each other very well. So I'm really looking forward to this. Thank you for having me on this lovely podcast.
It's my pleasure. And I reciprocate that feeling. I feel like we've known each other for quite a long time.
It's weird, isn't it?
Okay, well, I'd like to start off with a very important identity question, which I related quite deeply to what you said in our preliminary chats before today's recording, which you mentioned that you identified with being, or at least saw some positive benefits of being an outsider. Can you give us a more detailed picture into your relationship with this outsider's identity, if you can?
I do sense that the outsider quality is something that's always been very important to me and what I do and how I relate to others as well. Perhaps it's something I'd not really reflected on until the opportunity was given during the pandemic. One can't downplay the tragedy of the time, but we also have to find the positives where they are in order that we can continue to move forward. And I do think that that's a very important thing that we do to extract meaning from our experience here. Otherwise, it's just a wasted 18 months, right? And I do think that the space has brought opportunities for us to clarify the past, and see it perhaps in a different light so we can understand the present and maybe make different decisions in the future. I've been forced to realize this in a number of different ways, even very recently. With certain decisions one has to make where there are logical reasons why you could go either way. So both positions are logically defensible. That's the definition of a dilemma, right? Where you could do either, and both come with pros and come with cons, and they're roughly weighted. And actually, then it just becomes a feeling of how in tune with myself am I? What's going on in my gut? And what I've often found is that by going against one's gut, not only is there a spiritual price to pay of some kind, because we're going against our internal truth, our meaning, but also in some cases there can also be a financial cost attached to it as well. So imagine, by making poor decisions over a period of time, how much energy, money, opportunity one is actually hemorrhaging away. Often for me, the nature of those decisions has been really, really difficult because it's involved, for instance, I guess the one which caught people's attention at the time was I decided after one term to leave the Royal Academy of Music to pursue a career as a freelance composer, conductor and as musical director of the Ensemble. And that was an unusual decision at the time. It was unusual among my Purcell School peers, for whom the normal thing was to go from music school to music college, which is a very legitimate thing to do, by the way, providing one has assessed what the trade-off is. What is it that, given that I'm going to be getting into so much debt, and what is it that I'm getting back? And if I'm not getting anything back, then is it really the right thing for me to do to be searching for my meaning and my learning experience there? What I found is that I was having meaningful experiences out in the world, outside the system. And that's where I've sought it ever since. I think the same's been true with the corporate work I've done as well. I'm very much an outsider, exploring this topic of creativity from the perspective not of someone with experience in business, but with experience in the creative arts, bringing those lessons into different scenarios, because I do believe that everything is transferable. But until all of this happened, I guess I thought, well, we've got to make our own paths. Maybe in my conducting manifests a desire for leadership and to bring good, to bring interesting different things into other people's lives, which are valuable, which maybe people hadn't thought of before. But actually, what I realized is that no, it's something much deeper. It's core to who I am, is that I invent things from scratch, which means that I can never be at the center of an orbit which has already been established. because my role, and I see it as a very positive role, is to challenge that orbit, to challenge the assumptions that we all make, and to ask probing questions. That's what creativity is all about, I think. It's about asking pertinent questions and making profound decisions. There's nothing trivial about it at all. Everything is profound, and everything for a creative mind, I think, is fuel, and there's possibility there. So I do take that responsibility of being the outsider and building something new from scratch, something that perhaps people thought was beyond the realm of possibility. And that is my aim with Echo. That explicitly is my aim. I've said that many times, is that as musicians together, we can achieve much more than we dreamed when we were apart. So for me, that's our definition of success as well, actually. When we come away from a performance saying, my God, at the beginning of the week, I had no clue we were going to be able to do that. That, for me, is the most wonderful thing to hear. Also, working with composers, I think, is the great privilege. And composers are the archetypal outsider, right? They imagine sounds no one's heard before. So I feel as though I'm maybe in the centre of a little bit of a historical whirlwind there. But it's taken my time to kind of work into that and to realise that it's something close to my heart. Also, of course, the Judaism element. It's a very, very small minority, and it means that my upbringing among my peers is quite an unusual one. I find that very interesting. Actually, I find it more fascinating as time goes on. And I mean, we were talking about this a little bit on email, weren't we, before we met? And I think that you've got something valuable probably to add to this discussion as well, of the outsider quality.
Absolutely. Because I grew up as a British-born Chinese in a very predominantly white town.
Right.
And that's not to say that there weren't any other ethnic minorities in my school. There were. But there weren't many ethnic minorities who had exactly the same cultural background as me and ethnic makeup as me. But at the time when I was younger, you don't really notice this isolation. You don't have the cognitive and sort of critical thinking ability to discern yourself in this kind of way. But you have an intuition that you are different in some way.
Right.
But it's not until you reach a certain age or a certain event in your life which sort of kicks everything into gear, and you start realizing that you are quite different. And I think this catalyst was, for me, when I met my first ever Chinese friend who was born in Hong Kong. And our sort of friendship did do that. It did kick into gear, that I was a bit different. I was a bit of an outsider. And as I got to meet more people in this usual terms of orbit, that sort of Southeast Asian orbit, the notion of being an outsider was sort of enhanced. I didn't fit in here either. And even amongst my British Chinese friends, I don't fit in there either. Save for music tastes, movie tastes are quite different.
Right.
Because I don't know about you, but there are some stereotypical tastes that cultures have. And stereotypical tastes that certain generations within that culture have. And I find myself not really fitting in with those stereotypes of taste within cultures. And that further makes the feeling of being an outsider even more sort of prominent.
Yeah.
And I want to direct this question back to you. Do you ever feel like you want to be back into sort of the, not, for lack of a better word, mainstream, because being an outsider is too painful? Have you ever wished to be part of the majority?
Well, one senses that it makes for an easier life, right? Whether you want to call it the majority or the mainstream. I think mainstream's a really nice description, actually. Or perhaps the establishment. to be on the inside of that rather than constantly challenging it, or on the outside of it, building something new. Building something new with an absence of role models is perilously difficult, spiritually, as well as in terms of, physical exhaustion. And there's no shortage of questions one needs to ask oneself on that journey. It's very, very difficult. So, yes, there are moments, I would confess. I'd be lying if I said, oh no, this has always been what I think there are moments when I've had really trying decisions I've had to make. Am I going to go with the flow here, or am I going to stick up for what I really believe in? However, I never once have regretted being Jewish. And I think it's interesting what you just highlighted when you said there was a moment, right, when it came home for you and you had an awakening which changed your perspective. For me, that happened very recently and in a very painful way, which was there was an outpouring of anti-Semitism, mostly online, but in the physical realm as well, all across Europe and America, but in Britain more than anywhere else. And it was painful to watch on every possible level. That put me in touch with my inner Jewish identity in a way that I haven't really felt before. And it's beginning to come out in my music, which is very interesting. It's come out before in little ways, but it's beginning to manifest in ways which I hadn't expected and which I find really, really interesting. And the theme of that exploration is, when will there be a moment when the Jewish community, which is tiny, can have this grace period? There's been, it's been a huge, tumultuous year. All kinds of, landmark events and all kinds of movements and progress. And I think we talked about this before, following the murder of George Floyd, following earlier this year the Stop Asian Hate, following the awful things which happened with Sarah Everard. There was this grace period where we said, right, let's give this a minute. Let's engage in dialogue with people. Let's listen, not interrupt. Try and educate ourselves. Meditate on this a little bit. Try and understand from a broader perspective. And recontextualize what we thought we knew, so we can bring it into line with other people's lived experience. And that is a very valuable thing. But that same grace has not been offered to the Jewish community after what happened in May and what has continued to happen. Anti-Semitic incidents are all too common. Just because I hadn't experienced one to my face before that time. So I think a lot of that energy, that very sort of, in a way it's very negative energy, but how do we as artists expel that? We do it by making stuff. And I do think that's a very healthy thing to explore. In a sense, music is usually more abstract. You don't necessarily know what it is someone's going on about in a piece of music because it's notes. It's not, even intellectually with words, what are we trying to do with words? We're trying to put them together in such combinations that we can express an idea, but it's still limited by the nature of the language that we have at our disposal, which is why, freedom of speech is so important. We'll talk about 1984 later, I'm sure. And the reduction of language, the Newspeak dictionary, where each edition has less words in it so that we can conceive of less thoughts. It's such a fascinating idea. But at the moment, we have this wonderful palette of words that we can use to express our thoughts. Music is the same. We have this wonderful palette of notes and tonalities and opportunities and a vast, eclectic range of timbres that we can explore too. So it's not necessarily easy on an intellectual level to know what someone's going on about. Maybe on a more emotional level, we feel like we can engage. But to have something so specific come into one's life, which one feels one needs to express in music, I'm just very curious as to what's going to happen with that.
I'm very, very glad that you brought up the sort of Newspeak dictionary and the gradual reduction in language and thus sort of the constriction of expression.
Yeah.
And that might put a sort of some strain on the way we can bring out our thoughts so that other people can understand. I just want to draw a comparison with music. Do you think composition has its limits in expression?
Maybe limits isn't the right word, because in a greater sense that it is, of course, limited, it is also unlimited. I wonder what the correct word would be. I think it works within certain confines, doesn't it? I mean, human imagination is like a gaseous form, right? It will spread to fill its container. And if the container is too big, it gets so diffuse that we can't use it. Or it just stops functioning altogether, frankly. If the container is too small, then it's under too much pressure and it will collapse in on itself. It can't function. It hasn't got space to be. So there's a marriage in there somewhere which perhaps is the same as this contradiction that we've just drawn. You know, limited, unlimited. I don't want to get, again, 1984 is on my mind because I've reread it recently, and I don't want to get too far into doublethink, because then logically war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. That's the whole point of that. Some people see being able to hold contradictory thoughts in your head at once as a sign of genius. And Orwell says, yes, perhaps, but there's a very dangerous precedent there. So I don't want to suggest that at all. However, I do think that the particular facets of music create interesting possibilities and a good sized container in which the human imagination can operate on a very, very high level, intellectually, and also on a deep, deep emotional spectrum beyond even the capacity of language, I think. I really believe that. Also, I believe that music is incredibly valuable to society because it teaches us to listen, which is what we need right now. We need to learn to listen, not with the aim to respond, but with the aim to understand. So in that sense, the sky's the limit in terms of composition. And I do see my composition process as a facilitation of listening for musicians and audience members.
I think that's a brilliant analogy with the box and the gas. I truly think that's... I never thought of it that way before.
Neither had I. I think that might be true, though.
I think so. I think so. No, I think you made me rethink that limit might be the wrong word. Might be. Yeah. It's something that's hard to measure, right? You can't really measure the boundaries of music. It's impossible, right?
This is something I feel very strongly about, because we have such a culture in music, don't we, of competitive spirit. In fact, one of the things which actually began to put me off conducting, I still conduct, as you know, but one of the things which made me realise it wasn't the only career strand I wanted was that it seemed all too easy to get a golden ticket into the career by winning a competition. Competitiveness is a very interesting trait because it's not altogether bad and it's not altogether good. I think that often we use it as a default strategy where instead it's much more useful as something particular to be deployed in a particular scenario. I mean, if we want to win the game, then we compete. If we want to change the game, we have to collaborate. Now, competition and collaboration are often staged as opposites. I don't believe that's completely true. Collaboration is the aim of the game, I believe. For me, the opposite of collaboration is actually conflict. And it's easy to see why when you look at what motivates the two of those, right? Collaboration is rooted in trust and psychological safety. Conflict is all about fear. And when you look at all the major world wars and conflicts of recent history, and of any history, frankly, that's what you see, is this deep-rooted sense of fear and a lack of security. So it doesn't always have to operate on that level, of course. Conflict can be everyday and petty. Collaboration can also be something that we work into our everyday routines. But I do think that being competitive, the competitive spirit getting in the way as our default programming, can actually lead us to take, coming back to what you said, the measurable facets of what we do, which are very few, because so much of what we do is unmeasurable, right? And present them as though they're important. And that's how art becomes a sport. Is, 85% of the shifts were in tune, or 97% of the time the orchestra played with perfect intonation, or perfect ensemble, or, the serve speed was 125 miles per hour. What's the difference, right? That's not what matters about the music making. So for me, competition in music is nonsensical, and we need to do a good deal of pruning over the next few decades to really bring us back from the brink, because a competitive musical culture is not only tokenistic, but it has real negative effects for everyone, I think. It can, we know that it has negative effects on the mental health of pretty much anyone who engages with it, unless they're very, very smart. So,
just as an exercise of sort of critical thinking, let's sort of unpack collaboration.
Right.
Because I noticed you said some good things, positive things about collaboration, and some not so positive things about conflict and competition.
Right.
Just to unpack this, are there any negatives for collaboration, do you think, however small they may be?
Oh, yes. What did Churchill say? Democracy is the worst possible form of government apart from all the other ones. It's a huge undertaking to decide we're going to do this, not least because it involves shedding the ego of the situation. And that is a very, very difficult thing to do, because, it's easy to say, but what it actually means in practical terms is that you have to let go of any expectation you might have about the final product. And when we're very weighted towards the final product, we have 3 days with an orchestra who speak a different language to us. We've never met them before. And we've got 5,000 people coming to a concert of repertoire that none of us have ever done before. We just make the final product good, just give them something that they can. Actually, I think, the whole way that orchestras and rehearsals are structured and things, that's a whole separate discussion. There's loads of reform that we can do there. It's just sort of evolved unthinkingly in terms of short-term demands, and we can really rethink that in a much more positive way, I think. But in terms of the difficulties, I wouldn't say negatives, but they are the difficulties of collaboration and getting used to collaboration, is that every single person involved in the collaboration is obliged to contribute, but they also have to let go of their personal image of the final product which they cling to. Because ultimately, if you have 10 people in a group and they all have that image, none of them are going to be the same, and nobody's going to be satisfied. Whereas if all we focus on is maximizing the potential in the group, and enabling every single of those 10 people to be at their natural best all of the time, and to really give of themselves for a common cause, what we will get out the other end might surprise us with how good it is. Because it's something, again, to come back to what I said about the Echo Project, it's something beyond what we thought was possible. That is the high watermark for collaboration. And it involves an ego sacrifice, which is very difficult.
For sure. Absolutely. Yeah. When you have that many people, I think it's hard because musicians have very strong personalities.
Oh yes.
And they know what they want, and sometimes it's hard to sacrifice that desire for what they want musically, because music is so subjective as well, and sometimes yielding to others' interpretations, especially when it doesn't really agree with your own, is quite difficult. I find it quite difficult sometimes.
And so do I, absolutely. And again, I hear the sort of outsider in me speaking again. I have conflicting feelings on this. As a composer and as a conductor, it's a very different experience. So let me see if I can unify them.
Yes, please.
I mean, some musicians have strong feelings. I think it's okay not to as well. There's nothing wrong with that. And there's nothing wrong with not wanting to contribute.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe I would review my terminology earlier. I used the word obliged to contribute. Perhaps that's not true. But I do sense that there has to be the opportunity for those who want to contribute to do so. That is a really crucial opportunity to give to people. And of course there will be disagreements. And I think we're all the richer for talking through our disagreements in detail. And perhaps that's not something that we always have to do in the rehearsal space. Perhaps that's something that we do beforehand. We organise opportunities for us to have coffees one-on-one, intersectional. You know, that's just an idea I had off the top of my head. Actually, that would be really good. Or a sectional where we don't play at all, and you know, all the cellos just get together and talk about certain things, and then they get together with the violas, and maybe they have a, you know, it's a longer process, but it yields much richer results if there's more speech, more dialogue. And again, if we need to learn how to listen in order to do that, that's great. We look to music as our guide for doing that. My experience as a composer is quite different, because often people are coming to you and thinking that you have all the answers. Wonderful story. I think it's William Walton, the premier of Belshazzar's Feast. Somebody asks him what he meant in this bar or that, with some detail. He said, "I've got no idea. I wrote it however many years ago." And you know, there's this expectation on composers. I see that a composer in various different roles, and actually you move from being a creator, where you create something from scratch, where before there was nothing, there is now something, to being a mechanic. And that is where you are servicing the needs of the ensemble or the performer, and you're actually collaborating with them to create the best possible experience. That means working with them to find out the limitations of the instrument, or whether they have a preferred technique for doing this or that. Really, really interesting. But I do think actually that musicians know and understand much more than they think they do. And my wish for the future, and what I try to nurture in situations where I'm doing my own music, is to enable them to have their own thoughts about my music and not to actually get in the way too much. Because ultimately, if the music's going to survive beyond when I'm here and no one's going to be able to ask me anymore, I want to know that I've given enough guidance on the page for it to stand on its own 2 feet and to be interpreted in a myriad of ways without my presence there. If it can't do that, then in some way I failed. I failed the piece itself, actually, because the piece is like a child, and one can't be an overbearing parent, but you also have to give it what it needs. You need to help it move out into the world and socialise properly. You know, it's a very complex job. You know, I'm not actually a parent. It's quite difficult for me to draw that analogy without being ridiculed, but I do, from the lessons I've learnt from my own parents, who were absolutely wonderful, and I realise every day just how wonderful they were, actually, and continue to be. I do sense that it is a sound analogy, actually.
I'm actually very intrigued that you mentioned mechanic when it comes to composing. It's something I've come to use, that definition I've come to use when it's sort of writing for me, writing essays.
Right.
It's that is exactly the same conclusion I came to, that definition as a role. Because when you're a writer, or anything creative, when you're creating something from nothing, and not just that, making sure that all the parts interconnect and play out well and function well. Because in writing a good essay, every word counts. To put forth the argument, every word counts. And the way that words are laid out, the paragraphs are laid out, how big the paragraphs are, and the flow of the topics, you are actually essentially an engineer with words.
Yeah.
And like any good or mechanic, but I think engineer might be one to use as well, because when you're engineering something, you want to make things as economical as possible. No wastage.
Yeah.
Does that as a composer yourself, where does economy play in composing? Would you go for economy at the expense of musical expression, or if there's a musical expression that, that sort of makes it suffer economically?
What a great question, Anthony. Even composers that I love, I think, have sometimes gone for economy and engineering over musical expression. In some senses, it's a gift. Britain could make music out of anything. And as a result, there are wonderful pieces by Britain and other pieces which are sometimes hard to distinguish from the wonderful ones. I'm using Britain slightly unfairly as an example here. There are many composers like this, but it's hard to distinguish them because the technique is so good, but actually underneath there's nothing there.
Right.
And I find that frustrating, but it's something that as musicians we have to live with. I had a teacher once who drew a line in the sand for me, the difference between composition and improvisation. The line that she drew was that composition is about being able to take a single idea, recognize which of our many ideas are the ones which actually have worth, then take a single idea and really maximize its full potential, which involves great economy. With Beethoven, I think he was incredible at creating his biggest pieces out of his smallest motifs. It's incredible. That's a piece. I mean, who could possibly think of that? And he did that time and time and time again with practically all of his pieces. It's directly proportional. The smaller the original nugget, the bigger the piece. Improvisation is about being able to have a string of cogent ideas which move fluidly from one to another. So like this conversation, we're not really economizing here. We are exchanging ideas. And that's incredibly valuable because it's true to life. Whereas composition is true to a different facet of life, which is our desire for storytelling. Storytelling is something we've always done as beings, and it's necessary for us. We tell ourselves stories because it enables us to create meaning out of our life history and our surroundings. And by creating meaning, we find the motivation to go forward. So I think both are valid and valuable and both have their place. I guess the thinking about economics, when you were talking about it, it reminded me of my late mentor, John Whitfield, who often spoke about great music as being fashioned like a wonderful three-piece suit or a mahogany chest of drawers. These amazing analogies he would think of. His imagination, the connections he was able to draw, even though he was not, by the time I knew him, a well man, were quite beyond what most human beings are capable of. It was astonishing. It was a true education in what made great music. So I think pure economy is to our peril. I'm now thinking about my own music, and I think often the bits which really make something work are the bits which don't quite make sense and don't quite fall within the purview of what the piece is supposedly about. Something I do by mistake, perhaps, or that I add on a whim, even though I don't really know whether it fits with what I'm doing, and turns out it does. It's rather nice. And it's those moments which are special and make people sit up and go, oh, I didn't expect that. So I wouldn't call myself the most economical composer, and I actually would like to think that that's a badge of pride, but there's plenty of time for that to change.
I think it depends on the nature of the piece as well, right?
Oh, surely. Yeah, I mean, in a sense, it's much easier to be economical in a solo piece, which is why I think it can be used in an educational way, writing for solo instruments. I find writing for duo or trio is the hardest thing you can possibly do, because making those voices work with and against each other and restricting yourself to the idea that you've settled on and which you know is the one, rather than just enabling it to become a stream of consciousness, just allowing it off the leash, which is very tempting. by the time you've got an orchestral piece, there's so much colour at your disposal. You've got so much choice. And actually, most orchestral pieces these days are quite short, so you can really get away with anything. Not to say that one should, but I know that some people can and do. So it's, in a way, writing those leaner pieces, particularly chamber music. I grew up on chamber music, playing chamber music with friends and colleagues. Many of the colleagues who are now my echo compatriots, if you like, are people with whom I played chamber music when I was as young as 6 or 7. And that experience of making music together, particularly being a cellist, being the anchor, being at the bottom of the texture, providing the harmonic content and drive, and the old adage that a quartet is as good only as its cellist. It can be no better, because that's where the momentum comes from. I think cellists have such a wonderful, rich existence down there that's why often cellists go and do interesting things. You can't lie with the cello. It's so connected to the human body in its shape. It's so connected to the human voice with its tessiture and its tone. There's a London Cello Society, of which I'm part. Could you imagine a London Violin Society, I wonder?
Probably not.
No. So, I feel fortunate there. That was a great education.
Going off from when you mentioned that writing for duos is quite hard.
Right.
Is there a medium or a combination of instruments or any particular singular instrument that you feel like you have total control over?
Oh,
that getting your expressive ideas onto the page, there's no dilution at all. You can get what you want.
My God. That would be a wonderful world to live in. I guess the cello sits most naturally.
Okay.
Because I know how it feels. I try always to empathise with the musicians I'm writing for. I love talking to them when I can. If not during the writing process, then after it, and working very closely with them. Not always at the expense of the musical content. These things can go too far. Sometimes you have to put your foot down. I think some composers could learn the difference between difficult and too difficult. Yes, it's hard, but it is exactly what I want. One player I work with quite a lot said to me recently, a piece we were working on, said, "Oh, Noah, I got all the rhythms right that time. You know what's so frustrating is that they did actually sound better when I got them right." Back to your question, though. I do find naturally the empathy with the cellist is more, because I understand it, and therefore I find it very natural and easy writing for string players. But still, there are huge difficulties, particularly with violin writing, that I find it very hard to do. And in a sense, sometimes it can depend on the piece as well. There are times when, particularly writing for oboe and for clarinet, have come, I feel, quite naturally, usually when I have a very strong idea in advance of what it is I'm seeking from that piece. And other times when it's furiously difficult. It is that strange contrast. Sometimes you just cut through these things like a hot knife through butter on a warm day, and sometimes it's just a total nightmare. I find brass very difficult. I really struggle to understand the physics of the French horn. I don't understand how anyone plays it. I have true respect for those gurus, those gods who manage to play French horn. And recently I've been writing a lot for trumpet and working a lot with trumpeters. Katie Lodge, Rebecca Toll, who have been enormously helpful and supportive with that. So I feel like I've learned a lot there, and I feel like there's a lot still to learn.
Yeah, I've been troubled by the idea of free will. And I've been trying to relate this with inspiration and with musicians as well. Because inspiration for some people can be quite random at times, and musical ideas, if we had free will, we wouldn't be banging our heads against the table trying to write or compose, and if we had free will we can just do it. But sometimes ideas just don't come, and you never know when they come. And sometimes some people have sort of rituals they do, and maybe go for a walk. That might spur up some ideas to get some sort of maybe an essay idea or a musical motif that they're trying to work through, that they're trying to be inspired by. But sometimes that's not a guarantee, these methods. How do musical ideas come to you personally, and whether do you think you have free will over yourself?
That's such an interesting axis to draw, Anthony, with free will. And I think it's true with interpretation probably as well, as a player. And I'd like to ask you about that philosophically as well. I won't dodge your question though. Let me try and answer it first.
Sure.
I mean, the experience of having the idea and everything just going, hearing it in one's mind's ear and just being able to write it down is every creative person's dream.
Yes.
And for it just to work and communicate itself perfectly, it's almost like the thing is writing itself.
Yep.
Many people over the centuries have communicated this idea in one way or another. I've been very lucky. That's happened for me several times. I think my favourite story of that is probably Cornucopia, my solo overpiece for Catherine Breyer, which I had the idea for when I was hoovering and I heard these oboe multiphonics in the Hoover. I was like, no, that's wrong. That can't possibly be. But it's like, no, this is an idea. I'm having an idea. Get action stations. I am having an idea. And then you have to catch it while it's there. And there is the sense that it's fickle and it's going to go away. Although actually I have found that they are remarkably constant and will stay with you for months. Sometimes one needs to break through something. For the Candle Lagoon, an orchestral piece I wrote, all I had for months was 3 chords, and I could not work out what to do with them. And the premiere date was getting closer and closer, and I had to print the parts, and the piece wasn't there yet. And then suddenly you make a breakthrough and it's all clear. So I think time does play a role in it. When I was exploring Einstein and special and general relativity, I started having obviously different thoughts about the nature of free will, because it's easy to say, well, if those ideas come from another place, maybe we don't have free will after all. And actually when we're just banging our heads against a brick wall trying to work something out when there's no inspiration there, well, isn't that a terrible thing to do? Because obviously it's not meant to be. You're working against fate. Einstein offers an amazing perspective. In fact, it's a perspective so amazing that more than a century after he wrote about it, we are still totally incapable of integrating it into our lived experience. The idea of relativity is just too scary. It is too at odds with the world as we know it for us to fully appreciate without knowing the maths intimately. It's like discovering that the earth is not flat. I mean, it looks flat. How, prove to me that it isn't. Of course, we now know rockets went up into space and took photographs. But from our a priori experience, that's not obvious. Suddenly when you have an idea that time is actually a physical expanse like space, and everything that ever happened or ever will is already there, it gave me a great confidence in writing music, because all the pieces I haven't written yet are already written somewhere. And now for me it's more a process of taking them down off the shelf, which is much less strenuous than feeling like you're working against something constantly. And I feel as though you have a thought on that. Yes. It looks to me like you do.
No, that's really, really crazy that you mentioned this.
Okay.
The feeling that it's already there.
Yeah.
It's just time for you to take it off the shelf. It's scary how that's so similar to a thought I had a few weeks ago.
Oh, go on.
There's a lot of the things that we discover will always be there regardless of whether we're here or not. It's just that so happens we discovered it and put a name to it. So everything... Yes. This might not be a good logical jump, but if that's so, then surely that should give us more confidence in creating stuff from nothing because it's already there. We just need to have time on our side and to discover it.
And this comes back to my belief. Creativity is like a worldview for me, and it brings me a lot of hope that we are creative beings at heart. And actually, so often it's about, again, getting rid of the ego, the I, the me, the mine, and thinking about who it is we're serving by doing this. And when we do that, we can become a sort of channel through which creativity and the work itself flows.
Mm-hmm.
Much like love or, our life itself, it's not something that we can ever really own, I don't think. It's something that, we have to be open to, and we allow it to pass through us. All the important things. There's an amazing passage which made a big impression on me in a book called The Four Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz. Are you aware of it?
No.
It's a book of kind of Toltec wisdom, this ancient wisdom. And actually, I think it's applicable to all kinds of different spiritual faiths, whether or not they're religious. This idea is a powerful one, and it's about the angel of death. And it talks about confronting the angel of death. And the angel of death basically says, everything you are and everything you own, I can take away from you at a moment's notice. You don't own it, but I'm letting you have it for the moment. That's a profound insight from someone. And then I think how we turn it into something productive, what's the next step is, okay, so while we have these things, what are we going to do with them to make the world a better place? How are we going to create meaning? And I don't think that, I think that's applicable to anyone living any kind of life with any kind of worldview. Essentially, every worldview is a creativity worldview. I would say that, wouldn't I? I'm obsessed with creativity. I wonder how this idea of free will comes to bear rather than on creation.
Yes.
As a performer, your role is interpretation in music. I still think that both creation and interpretation involve imagination. In that sense, they are both deeply creative pursuits. But it can feel as though we have this very weighty, invented hinterland, which maybe restricts and limits some of our musical decisions. Mm-hmm. I wonder how your perspective as a performer and as a journalist actually come to bear here.
There's a question I've been... Not question. There's an excerpt of an essay by Alfred Brindle that I've been taking around on this podcast. Because both I found it incredibly interesting and confusing. Because he didn't really state that much about it. He said that we shouldn't treat old music, so music like Bach, Handel, Beethoven, Mozart, like titans in the museum, quote unquote. We shouldn't leave them there to be preserved, but instead we should be relating them back into our own times, reinterpreting them in the context of how we're living now. But this caused some trouble for me in my thinking, because a few months earlier I was watching Leonard Bernstein's Young People's Concerts.
Right.
And in the very first lecture he gave, he was re-examining the definition of classical music. And instead of classical music, we should probably think about the term exact music. Now, this was 1950 or 60. So things might have changed since then. Now, these two ideas were very, very much conflicting in my mind. So how can something be exact music be reinterpreted into our modern times? If the framework for interpretation of exact music is so narrow, how do we find space within this to be creative and related to our own times? And maybe trying to relate it back to free will, Is it... I had one person tell me that to define a character in a piece of interpretation is about space and time. How you place the notes, and also the space and time between those notes you place. That defines a character, your identity in the piece. But I just find that really difficult to operate in, because with modern day recordings and modern day interpretations, it's hard not to think that everyone sounds almost identical.
Yeah. God, yeah.
And there's
So
a pressure.
true.
There's a pressure from critics as well that makes us sort of commit the sin of boringness and conformity. I really want someone to take these pieces by the reins and really make it themselves, and not be pressured by critics to conform, and to use their own sort of creativity and their own, if you like, free will to create something special.
Bit hypocritical of Bernstein to claim that, given that that's basically what he did. Also worth remembering that he described himself less as a conductor than as a rabbi, as a sort of spiritual leader. And, you know, I guess that may also bring to mind the concept of orthodoxy, which is an unquestioning nature. For me, that's the carnal sin, is to be unquestioning. The really crucial thing is that we always question, we always engage on a deep level. Again, that's something that John taught me to do, and it has led me to maybe fall down more on Brendel's side, in that, or on this occasion, I should say, in that the greatness of a musical work is not in the one necessary interpretation, but in the multiplicity of ways it can be interpreted. The music which survives, take Beethoven 9, you know, an anthem of the Enlightenment, if you like. I find it problematic to call Beethoven a classical or a romantic composer. I see him as very much an Enlightenment composer. And that piece is program music for whatever time we happen to be living in.
Yeah.
So it's, you know, to think that we all have to, you know, people who like historical performance want to listen to it one way, people who like listening to Nigel Kennedy's version of The Seasons have to listen to it this way, and you know, I think we do need variety in our diet. We need to question the norms and not destroy them. There's nothing vicious about this. There's room for every possible interpretation and more. We don't have to destroy anything, but being probing with our questions is good. And it takes me back to something I heard Sam Mendes, film and theatre director, say in an interview, and he was actually talking about the rehearsal process in theatre, but I think it's equally applicable here. He said, there are no right or wrong decisions. There are no good or bad decisions. There are just interesting and less interesting ones. Now, maybe that's not good life advice, but in terms of how we exercise our creativity, I think that's really powerful.
What sparks your motivation and productivity in your composition? Is it to say something that means a lot to you, to express something that's embedded deep within that you want to get out, or is it driven by our sense or sometimes fear or acceptance of our mortality, and to live beyond our biological self and to have something of ours live beyond us? Or what is it that sparks you to be productive and creative?
Productivity is a very difficult thing to define. If we go back to Einstein for a minute, what he told us is that linear time as we experience it, we think we experience it, doesn't exist, which means that all of our normal indicators for productivity are actually bogus, because how do we measure it? It's produce created over time taken, but the time taken variable doesn't make any sense. If we show up to do the work will get done. If we don't, it won't, but it's there waiting to be done somewhere. So actually, true productivity is more erratic. It's more like this. It's like the creative process. It has peaks and troughs, and it requires failure and the exploration of dead ends to give us meaning and direction. Frustration is all part of the game. Linear productivity, which so many of us kind of aim for, that's not productivity. That's just production. A machine could do that. And it's not fulfilling. And it doesn't exist anyway. So why waste your life looking for that? You know? Once I accepted that, I found it much easier to accept myself as a composer, actually, because it is an erratic way of working. One does have to show up every day if you want pieces to get written. Otherwise, in general, they don't. Sometimes, by magic, they do. But on the whole, sometimes talking about, going back to catching an idea, as David Lynch would call it, catching the big fish. Sometimes it takes showing up and trying a bunch of wrong ideas to stumble on something which then provokes an idea, opens a door that you weren't even necessarily aware was there. As for the motivation, I am really interested in truth and morality and meaning. And through those kind of prisms of thought, it's enabled me to have really deep, meaningful connections with my family and my close friends and the colleagues that I work with and really thrive on collaborating with. I sense that there's a possibility in music to express something which is so true that it is impossible to express in words. We talk about words as though they're more concrete, and music is abstract, or painting, colour, form is abstract. Actually, words are equally abstract. They're equally meaningless, It depends how one decides to compose things. Haydn was a great composer, an unusually great composer. He was incredibly prolific. He wrote 80 string quartets, 60 of which are masterpieces. That's a 75% hit rate. That's unusual. He wrote 100 symphonies, slightly more. He wrote 104 symphonies, about 80 of which are great masterpieces. That's an 80% hit rate. That's even more ludicrous. And he came before Beethoven and the Enlightenment, and he had more of a kind of rhetorical education. He was taught about structuring arguments and how to structure one's speech. And his music exhibits that in really interesting ways. Music is his preferred language for laying out a philosophical argument for something which he passionately believes to be true. And to my mind, the masterpieces are where he does hit on that kernel of truth. Composers have been doing it all the time. In every era, there have been a few who do it. And there have been many who perhaps try. Maybe they don't know they're trying. Maybe they stumble on it by mistake. Or maybe they spend all their lives trying to find it and don't quite, but their valiant efforts are very interesting. Either way, I do feel as though, searching for meaning is really important. That's something that I do with music. I'm just remembering an email from my mentor, John, may he rest in peace, that described one of my pieces that he was looking at, he was reviewing. I'm just moving through your landscape of the soul, was his words. And that, I think, he'd hit on a truth there, that's what music is.
I came across a concept called the end of history, which was, I think, first sort of theorized by Karl Marx and his partner Engels, and then passed over to Thomas More and repopularized or maybe developed even further by Francis Fukuyama, a political scientist. And basically it's a socio-political thought that there'll be a point in human existence where there'll be a form of government, a very desired government, which will be the end of conflict. There'll be nothing to fight for. which is that government is liberal democracy. There'll be other forms of government. That's not to say they won't exist, but they'll be inferior to the desired government, which is liberal democracy. And it is sort of suspected that that history will no longer develop towards something that we desire because we've already achieved it. Now, this is a concept I found very interesting. In the spirit of cross-pollinating ideas and fields, I've decided to apply this theory to music. Will there be, in your opinion, sometime in the future, very close or very far away, where we'll reach a point of, using the same word again that we used before, economic expression, or potent expression, or powerful expression, that we can use as musicians and composers to manifest our ideas in the best way possible? Or have we passed that peak?
Oh, thank goodness we're not there yet. The world is so polarized and segmented at the moment. I think there are spaces where we can see this happening, and there are spaces where we can see the opposite happening. And I don't know what to make of it, frankly. This is, by the way, Marx and the other philosophers and social scientists that you mentioned, I don't claim to know their work in great detail, so I'm not going to criticize them.
Sure.
But I do want to critique this idea of the end of history, which I do find very, very interesting, culturally and politically, economically, on every possible level. And you asked me earlier today what my greatest fear was, and it is the end of history, the end of change. On one end of the spectrum, we have composers who believe they have to conform to a certain idea in order to get ahead in their writing. So, again, coming back to competitions, I spoke recently to someone who was on a panel. They adjudicate a lot of different international composition competitions, and no matter the nationality, there will be 6 months when everyone is writing in a very particular style, imitating a particular passage from a particular composer, and basically taking that passage and recomposing it in every possible different way. Because it's in vogue. Sometimes that can go on maybe for several years even. It's probably different in America from what it is in Central Europe and stuff. And obviously Western classical music is not the only kind of music. It's a very narrow subsection of what music is globally and what it can signify. But within that is certainly possible. Why do people conform to that? Well, because it means it can perhaps put them in touch with certain summer programs. If they get onto the summer program, they can have their work critiqued by certain professors who perhaps work at certain institutions that they then like to go study at, where they connect with other professors. By the time they've connected with those other professors, they are tipped to win certain competitions and be commissioned by certain orchestras. And then every commission that they get is a shop window for the next commission. And what we get is, forgive me being blunt about this, meaningless, vapid music, which simply follows the cultural trajectory, a stylish trend. But ultimately, it's very meaningless. So that is sad. And what I see is the conformity element of the end of history. What I don't see is the constancy. After a certain amount of time, people always move on to something else. And that does give me hope that actually it will not stagnate completely. On the other side, of course, we've got what Leonard Meyer called in one or other of his books, I think it's Meaning and Emotion in Music. It's not what I would consider meaning and emotion in music. I think he puts it out quite dryly and logically, but in a very intelligent way still. He describes a kind of fluctuating steady state where we don't have one prevailing style anymore. It's all about every individual or every cultural group, perhaps, in the current kind of setup, expressing themselves specifically. I don't think either of these approaches is right. It's like minimalism and maximalism. They're two ends of a scale, very extreme. There's so much grey area in the middle. I am suspicious of anything that ends in ism. It just seems a shame to me. It's like a wasted opportunity. So the problem with everyone just expressing themselves, like we had from the 1950s onwards, when contemporary classical music in the West became suddenly incredibly complicated and split in a profound way away from popular music, which most people decided they wanted to listen to and engage with because they felt it expressed them, it suited their needs, it was for them. Whereas the kind of experiments that contemporary classical composers were engaged with were for the composer's own benefit. And it was almost like, I don't care whether people are interested in listening to what I have to say or not. It's still very important that I say it. And if people don't want to hear it, then, well, screw them, you know. And it's fine as an experiment, but to then put that on a concert platform and expect people to listen to it and engage with it, it's, you know, when it's not constructed with a service-oriented frame of mind, that's a big demand you're putting on audiences if you want them to follow you. And ultimately, people don't come to concerts for us, the musicians. They come for themselves because they have a need to discover this thing, this elusive, again, I believe it's truth and meaning, and objective collective morality. What I mean by that is not a kind of end of history sort of thing, but it's actually the need and actually the desire to contribute to the common good, not just to our own good. And sometimes actually to make sacrifices for the common good, as we've all needed to do during the pandemic. This has been a really interesting case study almost of that. To what extent have we been comfortable sacrificing some of our own freedoms for the greater good? And then, as times change again and we move back into normal life, how will we feel about claiming those freedoms back? That's one of the things, particularly in terms of free will, free speech, you know. Should the government be able to know where we're going all the time, who we're meeting, tell us that we have to stay at home all the time? You know, these are profoundly personal things. And in peacetime, if you like, how are we going to respond to the freedoms that we've had taken away? It's a really interesting precipice that we're on here. The end of history is something that always seems to be looming. You know, in the 80s it was looming. Now it's looming. And you know, again, I don't like extremes. We've got both the radical right and the radical left rearing their ugly heads in all kinds of ways and promising a sort of utopia which can never be. So I think we have to tread a very careful tightrope. But human creativity and innovation and imagination is such that it cannot and will not stagnate completely. We touched on 1984 before, which is fresh in my mind because I've just reread it and I was amazed at how much I missed the first time round. And in the intervening years, how much more of it has come to pass. Not that that's a litmus test of George Orwell's greatness. It's easy to read the book and just think, oh, well, he got that right, he hasn't got that right. It's quite a kind of reductive way of reading the book because it's about so much more than that. There's an afterword to 1984 by, I can't remember who wrote it actually, it's in the new edition that I hadn't read before. And it raises all kinds of interesting questions about things I hadn't considered. One of which really struck me. 1984 has one of the darkest and most powerful endings in all of fiction. The darkest ending you could imagine. Those indelible final words, you know, when I first read it when I was quite young, really imprinted on my skull, even though I hadn't really taken in the full weight of the book. And I hadn't understood that it wasn't really fiction. There was something about those words which just really stayed with me. And this raised such an interesting point, because after that there's the Principles of Newspeak, which is almost a scholarly essay. It's bizarre, right? Why follow up that powerful ending with something which is so banal and almost academic? Some people read it at the beginning, some people might discover it only at the end. He gave such a good answer to this question by saying that, isn't it interesting that it's written in the past tense? So it's a suggestion that actually the human spirit will always prevail, as it always has done in the past with these totalitarian regimes. There will always be original thinkers, And there will always be the potential for these things eventually, in some which way, to break down. It's almost like it's being written from an imagined future beyond the story of 1984, remarking upon it as a historical document rather than a dystopia, and saying, you know, it wasn't okay for Winston, it wasn't okay for Julia, but in the end, Big Brother did fall. The illusion came away. Now, I get very frustrated when people suggest that it's impossible to be original. My common response, which I don't always say to people's face, might be, well, just because you feel it's possible for you to be original, you know, just because you don't feel you're capable of it, why prevent other people who may well be capable of it? And I do have faith that the human capacity for imagination, which sets us apart from other life on Earth. In other ways, we're not that different. But as Ken Robinson reminds us in all of his wonderful talks and his books, culturally we are in a different league. And the human capacity for creativity and imagination is what will set us free, which is why when artists start talking about, censorship and stuff, that's when we need to be really careful, because artists, comedians, these people are the canaries in the coal mine. They detect early symptoms of the health of a culture, and those people will not shut up. And that's I think that's my duty going forward. I'm at a very early stage, but I feel it's very important that I don't shut up. So I will not shut up, which is why I'm very grateful that you offered the opportunity to do this. And it's been so lovely to chat, Anthony.
Well, thank you very much, Noah.